I want to first share an anecdote from my experience in government. I was serving a Croatian prime minister in 2016 during the Brexit crisis in Brussels, and I was accompanying him on many visits to this city at the time, 8 years ago. And as you know, these summits go on for hours and hours, late into the night, until everyone is exhausted and finally is not willing to resist the mainstream opinions, and then there's press conferences at 6 a.m. and so on. But that's how the European Union works, and I was able to perceive this at close glance. And what I wanted to share is the conversations I had with many leading figures in Europe at the time and top advisors to prime ministers who had hours of waiting while the prime ministers were seated in the next room. And I tried to spark conversations about serious topics like culture, like migration, like religion, philosophy, this idea of secularism, whether it can actually work and keep the EU running. And one thing I discovered was that the people at the top, the European elites, were terrified to even discuss these topics privately. There was a staggering cowardice. You could describe it as a kind of strange self-censorship, where even privately they refused to utter their opinions on these, you could say, controversial topics. And that's very worrying that it's not even possible to privately have a conversation with people at the top over the things that matter. Now, as an elected politician, I still always repeat the line from Richard John Neuhaus, the founder of this great journal called First Things in the United States. He made the point that politics is downstream from culture. Culture is really what matters most, and what in the end determines the fate of our countries. And I raise this because the left takes culture very seriously. If we look at the way public opinion is formed, who controls, for example, Hollywood or the media, the narrative, the mainstream narrative, it's more or less people who are hostile to our ideas, and they have obviously an advantage in politics because they control the culture. And we as conservatives must take this seriously. I think as someone who also teaches at a Catholic university, I can happily say it's still a safe place, my Catholic university in Zagreb. I can still teach the students freely and according to my own conscience and not be removed. But the reality is that academia is failing. I would also like to mention a dinner I had with Jordan Peterson in Zagreb when he was giving a talk about 2 years ago. He sold out a big concert hall in Zagreb, and I was able to have dinner with him. And one thing he said is that during the free speech controversy in Canada, not a single colleague of Jordan's at the University of Toronto, no one from his department or elsewhere gave him support and publicly or even privately was on his side. And this is very worrying because it reminds me of how communist countries used to function. Dissidents were simply thrown under the bus, so to speak. And that's what we're dealing with, I think, in today's Western academia. Many people who agree perhaps with Jordan Peterson's ideas have to keep a low profile, have to be very cautious, careful, even silent in order to survive. And that's a very, very worrisome situation. And we've seen what campuses have become in the West, especially in the United States. I grew up in America. It was unthinkable when I was a student in Missouri that a student group could simply cancel an invited speaker because they disagreed with his or her views. That was unthinkable in the early 90s, but it's become quite common today. And of all places, university campuses, where we must have freedom of thought, expression, freedom to exchange ideas, to explore, and to discover the truth. So I think we're living in interesting but obviously very dangerous times, dangerous in the sense that freedom of speech is not even defended anymore by the left. They don't believe it. It's really, as Nigel earlier said, a project today of power. Simply coercion and bullying people. And I can say what I've experienced here with this attempt to cancel this event reminded me of my growing up in Missouri. I had a deep aversion from as long as I can remember, probably the first grade, to bullies, but also to cowards. Cowards who today are in power and they're masquerading their cowardice as tolerance. That's what we're dealing with. And I think what was mentioned earlier in the morning session, that the virtue that today is most needed is courage. And I think this is something that Solzhenitsyn recognized when he was in exile in the United States. This lack of courage in America, even 40 years ago, where simple truths were not able to be expressed publicly. Now, there are signs of hope. Certainly signs of hope. The recent referendum in Ireland is a good sign, but also the farmer protests that have gained so much attention and momentum throughout Europe. I think we're witnessing an awakening by ordinary people that this project and the so-called European values are failing, are empty promises, just slogans and cliches. And this awakening, it will take time, but I think certainly people here at this conference are ahead of the curve. We have to drive the awakening, to accelerate it, to allow people, obviously, to express their views. I will likely now be running for the European elections in June, and I think there will be a major shift in the political landscape of Europe, and it's important to keep the momentum. Now, one person I always like to quote at least once in my remarks on culture and politics is the great English historian Christopher Dawson. If you have not heard of him, I urge you to Google his name. He was likely the greatest English historian of the 20th century, and a great scholar of world civilizations, especially European civilization. And he saw a decline after the Second World War in Europe and the entry of what he called substitute religions, pseudo-religions entering the space that was being relinquished by Christianity. And I think that's what's happened actually in Europe over the last several decades. We have, instead of political debate, we have basically a space where there's no compromise. And it's just a question of which side will be canceled. And this is untenable. This is untenable. And just as communism was never popular and took years to finally decline, I think we must also draw lessons from what happened in 1989. Many in the West have failed to understand why communism in the end collapsed, and almost miraculously in a very peaceful way. This is something that many scholars think about in Central and Eastern Europe. That's why I think there's great hope in this part of Europe, because there's a redemptive quality to all the suffering that was endured for decades. Unimaginable suffering. We've this morning been in a state of uncertainty whether they will shut us down or not, whether the police will simply ask us to leave. But under communism, there was just simply violent abuse of power on a daily basis. And people endured this heroically, anonymously, for decades. And in the end, it collapsed. So I think that we can learn very much in a city like Brussels, but also in the older democracies, of the value of suffering. If we're not prepared to suffer for the truth, for what we believe in the end, we won't prevail. It will take suffering. We shouldn't be naive about this. In closing, I want to say that this project, this movement, is in the end about our children and grandchildren. They're worth fighting for. That's why I entered politics myself. I think we have to gain strength. Just the fact that this event will take place in the end, and hopefully tomorrow as well, is a small victory. We should celebrate that this evening over drinks. And take courage in the fact that we are inheritors of really a great civilization. A great civilization where faith and reason are in harmony, not in conflict. And I think we have to defend the truth, defend everything that's most valuable in human existence, including beauty, the innocence of children. It is our responsibility to protect children from the madness that's being imposed in public schools especially. You know, I teach a lot about political ideologies, and of course Marxism was an awful idea, but this gender ideology that's being imposed on young children early in their childhood is really demonic. I really believe it's diabolical, and it's, thank you. And it's the responsibility of every adult, whether you have your own children or not, to speak up. People have been far too, I would say, passive and silent on some of these issues, and that's how culture declines over time, because people are too cowardly to speak. So I take courage in the fact that we're all still here in this room, perhaps not listening, but having a nice bite. But I look forward to friendly conversations with you in the future. And again, this fight is worth fighting. Thank you very much.